model of the world. So thank you, Gemma. That's it.
Thank you, Marco, for the introduction, and thanks for the invitation. I'm very happy to be here. I'm a fan of your lab, and also of all the other people that I don't know. And my title is Words Are Weird at All, because I gave a longer title, but then from the time I sent the title and the abstract to now, I've shifted gears a little bit. So in the talk, by the way, thanks to all my collaborators, especially Thomas Bolhagen and Eleonora Goldoni, who are a colleague of mine and a former PhD student, respectively, and who led much of the work that I'm gonna talk about. But what I was saying is that, well, broadly, I'm interested. I'm a linguist and a cognitive scientist. Sorry, and I'm interested in the interplay between cognitive and communicative pressures on language. Essentially, how the way that we use language leads to how the language is as a system, and the other way around. That's basically my main research interest. And I was going to talk only about what, like the two first parts from, sorry, like I was only gonna talk about this part one, but then I added the second part, which doesn't have to do with lexical semantics, which is what most of the talk will be about, but it's what I'm thinking about now, and I wanted to get maybe some feedback from you guys or some discussion. All right, so more broadly, so this talk has three parts, from longest to shortest, so don't worry, when you get to the second, number two, it will be almost over. The first part will be something I've been done in the recent years, which is what I call the many-to-many mapping between words and objects. Because if you think about it, language is a bit weird because words have many meanings, right? If the word mouse means both animal and this little thing, computer device, but at the same time, things have many names. So if I see a mouse, I can refer to it as mouse or animal, for instance, right? And this seems a bit weird, no? Why do we have this many-to-many mapping instead of something more stable and fixed, more orderly, okay? And scholars have been complaining, especially about the first, the lexical ambiguity, for a long time. The second hasn't received so much attention so far, but I think it's also intriguing, okay? And this will be the first part, and then the second part, as I was saying, it will be on something else that I will tell you about. All right, so far so good? Let's go. So let's start with the first part of the first part, namely the fact that words have many meanings. Just a couple more examples apart from mouse. In Catalan, the same word dit refers to what in English is called finger and what in English is called toe. It's the same in Italian and in many other languages, by the way. The word tawa in another language can refer to both fire and tree. And these are just a few examples, but this is a systematic, pervasive property of language. Words tend to have several meanings. For instance, according to a lexical database, words in Catalan have an average of 2.2 meanings. That means, you know, this is a really pervasive property. And then you may say, maybe this is something fundamental to language, no? If all languages are such that words tend to have many meanings, then there must be some kind of reason for that. At least that's my hypothesis. So I think that, sorry, but at the same time, of course, lexical ambiguity does introduce potential problems in communication, right? Because, for instance, if I say I broke my dit and I'm on the phone, you probably won't know if it's, you know, which kind of dit it is, right? So why do we do this if it's confusing? And in my view, it's because it's a very good way to solve a situation that we encounter all the time. So when we move about the world, we need to talk about new things all the time, right? But we can spend infinite cognitive resources. And in particular, we have a very rich but limited lexicon, so a few thousand words. So how do we do that? there's different ways we can coin new words, like, iPad didn't exist and now exists. But this is really the minority. And what we really love to do is to recycle words, all right? So for instance, when this new computer device was invented, instead of using a new word, people took mouse because it more or less resembles a mouse, all right? And this is super efficient because now we can go to a store, to a computer store, and say, I'd like to buy a mouse, please. Of course, language doesn't only have the lexicon, it also has grammar, right? And so we could, without inventing any new word, we could use grammar and say, I'd like to buy one of these computer input devices that can be controlled with one's hands, please. But that, requires much more effort. That's why recycling words is a very, very efficient thing to do. Now, this kind of meaning extension here, this requires the ability to use words creatively. That means use them in a new way. And you cannot just do this randomly because otherwise you will not be understood, right? There's the other listener there that needs to make sense of what you're saying. So there's quite a bit of art in the word extension part. And the hypothesis that I had with a few colleagues is that this ability to use words creatively that we find, I don't know if there's, if there's somebody saying something? Maybe they cannot hear us or something?
Probably they are logging from
Okay, that's perfect. I thought maybe they were sending messages to the chat saying we cannot hear a thing, so I was getting worried. Okay, perfect, thanks. All right, so some colleagues and I, we thought, well, this thing that we find in the lexicon of adults, this looks to us like it may be some kind of core cognitive foundation that we can find across diverse phenomena that on the surface are different, but have some common foundation. If this is the case, then we will find it, not only in the adult lexicon, but maybe in other phenomena. And indeed, what we did was to study different manifestations of what we call lexical creativity in this sense. The first one I've already illustrated, lexical ambiguity. For those who know about these terms, we are not distinguishing between polysemy, homonymy, and underspecification. The second phenomenon that we looked at is historical semantic change. So one thing is polysemy, in which at the same time mouse means both animal, rodent, and this computer device, but we also have a semantic change through history, right? Just a couple examples. For instance, the word fumbi in a language called Bukusu used to mean cloud and now means dust. The word trakai in Lithuanian used to mean mountain, now means forest. And yeah, I thought I had another example, but I don't. And the last phenomenon, and this is my favorite, is child overextension. And that requires a slide of its own. So let's start a new slide because it's too much fun. So if you've been around children who are between 1 year and a half and 2 years and a half of age, you will see, you will know already this phenomenon, right? It's like children have the same problem that we adults have, namely they need to talk about a lot of different things, but they have a super small vocabulary, right? And so what do they do? We think they do essentially the same. So they use this vocabulary in like very creatively to refer to all these new things that they want to talk to you about, right? And in the data set that we will use, we have evidence of children using the word dog or woof woof or bow bow to refer to a cat, a coat, a fur, an elephant, button, a frog, a hen, and many more. So you wonder at some point, if you're the struggling adult next to the child, you will know that sometimes it's a bit difficult, but they try their best. All right, so here, what we are dealing with are again phenomena that Polysemy and historical semantic change, they are different. They are, of course, related too. But they're both phenomena belong to the adult lexicon. And note that this is a product of language evolution over millennia, all right? So this is a long time scale. And it is something that happens, the dynamics happen at the population level. You need a lot of people doing the same extension for some kind of, for instance, historical semantic change or polysemy pattern to stabilize in the language as a whole, right? On the other hand, we have child over extension, which is a phenomenon that happens in language development in a single individual, okay? On a short time scale, months, it disappears spontaneously. Yeah, and it's at the individual level. So these are very different manifestations, and the main hypothesis of the paper is this that I was saying, that they share a common cognitive foundation. What does this mean? This means that we find in all these phenomena the same kinds of innovations. Yeah? All right. Now, what kind of innovations do we find? Well, they're based on semantic relatedness. So the basis for the use of a word in this creative sense, in this creative way, where we use the word creative in the sense that I've been illustrating, is semantic relatedness. And you have many different kinds of semantic relatedness. An obvious one is visual similarity. Sorry, this is a bad example because dog and frogs do not really look very similar. Yeah, I don't know why it's there. But cloud and dust, remember this was an example of historical semantic change, and like in English, you say clouds of dust, right? So you can imagine, you know, what happened there. The case of mouse is even clearer. We also have what we call associativity, like for instance, forests tend to be on mountains, and that is kind of what license this kind of change. And the same for dog and fur, like fur is something that you find on dogs. And then we also have, for instance, taxonomic relations, like finger and toe are body parts, right? That are also at the same, yeah, the same kind of end of limbs, etc. And dog and hen, even if they're very, very different, at least to adults, at the end of the day, they're both animals, right? So it kind of makes sense that children do this. Because again, it is quite crazy what they do, but it's not, you know, it's not arbitrary. They do it very well. Space 5 centimeters. All right. This was just to say that there's other types of semantic relatedness that may play a role. Now, we have our hypothesis, all right? And now we want to test it. How do we do that? So we take some data, we crunch it with statistical models. And what we do is, okay, because remember that what we think is that they share some, that they are the same kinds of innovations, right? So how do we test this? What we do is to build a model, like estimate the parameters of a model with children data, and then we test the generalization of this very same model, we test it on adult data, and vice versa, right? We do all the crossings of all the phenomena. And what we expect, because there is something shared, is that that this generalization will be successful to some extent. More specifically, what we have are logistic regression models, which take as input positive and negative examples. So for instance, at training time, at model estimation time, for instance, we give it, in the case of historical semantic change, we give it as positive examples, mountain forest, cloud dust, etc. And then we sample negative examples from the same database, just by taking pairings of unattested cases. For instance, we do not find cheap bracelet in any data point. We add it as a negative example. And the question that the models answer is, can these meanings coexist in the same word? That's the question that they're answering. Something that's very nice about nowadays is that you can use really huge databases that start becoming available in standardized format to do this kind of large-scale research. And actually, we were able to test a ton of languages for most phenomena. Like for lexical ambiguity, we use a database called Clicks, for which we extracted data about more than 1,500 languages. For historical semantic change, there's that same shift. Again, we could use over 1,400 languages. For child overextension, sadly, we only had English because that's the only data set that we could find. Now, what I said is that we give the model pairs of meanings, but how do we represent these meanings so that the model can learn something? Well, as features in the logistic regression model, as variables, what we have is the visual similarity between the meanings, for instance, the visual similarity between cloud and dust or between the two types of mouse. Associativity data, this is estimated with a computer vision model. Associativity data, which I guess you know, the small world of words network. This is just this data set that we use. I don't see everybody nodding. So yes, anybody? Okay, this is a data set that if I tell you, tell me the first word that comes to mind, and I say dog, most of you will say cat, but some other people maybe will say pet, vet, something else. So if you ask this to a lot of people, you get a lot of associativity data, and you can build some kind of network and estimate how associated two words are. Okay, this is what we use. Taxonomic similarity, we use WordNet for those who know it. If not, it's just a lexical database that tells us that both cat and dog are animals. And then we also use some affective norms for affective similarity. Like, for instance, children tend to use the same word sometimes for mom and dad, or for any adult that I like, including grandparents, for instance. This would be modeled by this modality. So these are all the features that we use. We do not claim exhaustivity. There's maybe many other semantic, dimensions that matter, but these ones have been related to at least some of the individual phenomena that we are modeling, so at least they are representative. All right? I don't give any more details about this. If you want, you can ask about that in the how we do that exactly. For instance, for visual similarity, you can ask about that later. Okay, I've been very sloppy so far. I don't know if you've noticed. I've been mixing meaning and word as convenient. Of course, words are not meanings, all right? So what we're interested in is meaning, and we use words as proxies. What does this mean? So we're interested in knowing, for instance, if cloud and dust, these concepts, can be put together in the same word in some language, all right? But meanings are not observable. So what we do is we use words, in fact, English words, as is usually done, as proxies for meaning. So if we want to estimate the taxonomic relatedness between cat and dog as concepts, as categories, what we do is we take the English words cat and dog, and we see if they are in the same node in a lexical database, all right? Which is the best we can do. All right, back to the models. So what we do is once we've trained them, we test them in two conditions. The standard condition is we train them, for instance, in historical semantic change, and we test them on historical semantic change. Mouth opening is another case of historical semantic change that is attested in the data. Of course, we train on data that the model has not seen, because otherwise it would be cheating, all right? So this is kind of a sanity check to see if the method works, because if you cannot even model the same phenomenon, how are you going to generalize it to another one? But the crucial test for our research question is what we call cross-prediction, in which we train on data from one phenomenon, but then we ask the model to decide, okay, given mountain forest, cloud and dust are positive examples, chicken bracelet are negative examples. Now, if I give you dog and frog, what do you tell me about this pair? Is it gonna be okay to put them in the same word or not? All right. And if we do this exercise with the same phenomenon, we get an accuracy of 74.81%. That means in roughly 3/4 or 4/5 of the case, in 80% of the cases between 70%, the model can guess it right. And here you have to compare it to 50% because the data set is balanced. So if it did it completely at random, it would guess it right 50% of the time. So we do significantly better. We are happy. Now, When we do the cross prediction, what we were expecting is something like 65%, because clearly there's something in common. But what we actually got was 72 to 81%. So, and that we were not expecting. So we got basically the same results, no matter the combination of data sets that we test. And of course, we were very happy. All right. the, okay, just to recap this part, we have been, remember that our hypothesis was that superficially these phenomena would be are very different. And in fact, they had been modeled in different traditions. Like most scholars don't look at polysemy and child overextension at the same time. And the hypothesis was that these are different, but essentially they're the same. At least there's something common to them that can be reduced to something more basic. And I think we provide good support for that. Now, I've been taking for granted that these innovations are based on semantic relatedness, right? I've been just saying that. But you may ask, why? Right? Why do we do it this way? Especially because it introduces confusion. It can introduce confusion. And the reason that has been given in other research than ours is that it's because it's cognitively advantageous, all right? If we do it this way, that makes languages easier to learn and to use. For instance, say that you're a Catalan toddler and you've learned that dit refers to these things here. Now you have some adult saying dit to refer to something in the foot of your little sibling. In this context, knowing this meaning of dit, the finger meaning, can help you in two ways. One is identifying the right referent, right? Because even if you point, it's not clear which part of the foot the adult is referring to. And second, so that can help you. And second, it helps you build a more compact lexical representation because you can recycle a lot of material already. It's a relatively small extension, right? So this is advantageous, and this is how people have explained this. This is an argument for acquisition. It can also be, the same argument can be made for use. Like, for instance, if we see a finger in our semantic memory, well, I don't know much about the brain, so I don't want to say, but I can imagine that the area of body parts will be activated, and then it's easier to get to the word to the concept for food, for instance. But yeah, I won't say much about this because I don't know this. All right, so this is what people have been saying. So semantic relatedness is good. Adding meanings based on that is good. However, it turns out that also previous work has said that there are conflicting needs sometimes between our cognitive needs to have languages that are simple enough that we can learn them and use them, and our communicative needs, which want us to make as many distinctions as we can in the world, so to speak, as many as we need, right? And these are often in conflict. And this is something that we hypothesized, Thomas and I, would happen in the case of the lexicon. All right? And now imagine that you have the concepts left and right. They're super related, right? They share all of the dimensions except for one. So why then, okay, let's put it in the same word. Let's put it, for instance, in the word DAX. Now, we are in this place in the woods, and I tell you go DAX. What will you tell me? Which DAX, right? So this is because in any context in which you may want to use the word left, you usually have a relevant alternative that is going right? So in this case, it looks like it's a bad idea to put them together, no? What's called collexify them. And what we hypothesized with Thomas is that we would find what we called a Goldilocks principle. Yeah, let me illustrate it. In which what you find is, okay, if things are unrelated, If concepts are unrelated, you're not likely to use the same word for them, because why would you? But if they're too related, like three and yes, you will never use the same word for three and yes. Too related, like left and right, you don't want to put them together because that would be too confusing. So there's this Goldilocks zone of the just right area, for those of you who know the fairy tale, like finger and toe, in which it's cognitively advantageous, and it doesn't cause too much harm in communicative terms. All right, to do this, because remember, we can always use grammar. And in Catalan, we say dit de la mà and dit del peu. So you can always specify which dito you want to refer to, right? So, and we are of course talking about tendencies here. And we do a study of over 1,700 languages using the same Clicks database, and we do find evidence for this Goldilocks principle. I will not say anything about the method, ask me if you want, because I'm aiming more for coverage in this talk than for depth. Okay, to wrap up this 1.1 part, we were asking why do words have many meanings? And what we conclude is that because it's very efficient communicatively and it's useful cognitively. Okay. Now let's go to the other side of the coin. The fact that things have many names. First, let me convince you that things do have many names. So say that I give you this image and I say, give me the first word that comes to mind in English for this entity in the red frame. Can you shout it? Anybody didn't think skater? Girl? Okay, good. So you're more or less like our participants. We asked this question to about 30 people for each object. In this case, 11 of them said girl, 7 said skateboarder, child 6, and skater 6. All right? Same object, different names. And this is part of a data set called Many Names that has 25,000 images. Go, if you want, play with it, because yeah, it took a lot of effort to put it together. So if you can use it, we'll be very happy. And if you check this data set, we get an average of 3.3 names per image. So again, it's not an anecdote. Most words, most objects in naturally, we were not constraining answers in any way other than telling them use just one name. So in naturally occurring images, people use many different names for the same object. And again, the question is why? Why do we do that? And this is especially puzzling because at least, you know, if you say skater or girl, you're given different kinds of information, right? But if you say girl and child, like essentially child doesn't really, you know, when one name subsumes the other, you wonder why that happens. For instance, the data that we will be using that was collected before us was asking people remotely connected to refer to one of 3 color chips in a way that the listener would be able to pick it. All right. And so, for instance, in this case, the speaker in our data set said purple. Yeah. And we have a bunch of expressions for English and a few for Mandarin Chinese. Now, in a different context, the exact same shade of color was called magenta. Yeah. I'll come back to the puzzle. Let me just explain. And so what we see, okay, sorry, I will say this later, but let me say it now. It may seem, to me, it's kind of weird, because if whenever you say magenta, you can say purple, like why do we have magenta at all? Okay. And the thing is that contexts differ in how informative you need to be, right? Because there, the 3 colors are very different. Whereas here, we have 2 purples. Well, I don't know how you see it, but in the original thing, it's 2 purples. So you have to be a bit more specific, right? So contexts differ in how informative one needs to be to successfully communicate. But also, crucially, words differ in informativeness. And I'll come back to this. So the hypothesis that we have is that having a redundant lexicon, in this sense that you have purple when you could have only magenta and then other types of purple, is efficient because it exploits variation in communicative needs. That is, it exploits the fact that we talk in different contexts. We need to refer to different things in different contexts. And let me spell this out. Here is what I was going to tell you. Why don't we always use the more informative words, right? So here, in both cases, we could use magenta. And you could say, okay, we have fewer words, right? So it's a simpler system at the end of the day if you have fewer words. But it's not that simple because more informative words tend to be more costly. More informative means that it informs you more closely about the shade of purple that you have in this case. And we know empirically, so these more informative names like magenta tend to be longer, less frequent, probably more difficult to retrieve, although I don't know literature about that. So the solution that speakers have found in our hypothesis is to have this partial redundancy in the lexicon, right? So that in easy contexts, you use general words. In difficult contexts, you use more informative words. And as a result, things have many names, okay? So this hypothesis predicts that redundant systems will be best if you look at them not as a static thing, just counting how many words, but if you look at them as a dynamic entity, as something that gets used across communicative situations, all right? In the sense that they achieve the most with the least effort. So we can check that with this data. And okay, I'm gonna skip the method just very briefly. What we're gonna say is that a word is more informative if it covers a smaller space, a smaller part of the meaning space, okay? So here are the chips that, sorry, I was forgetting about the online people. Magenta covers a smaller part of the color space than purple. Therefore, magenta is more informative. You don't need to know about the scale, but this is almost 3, this is 2.4, this is bigger, this is more informative, okay? And the same for Chinese. So just a fun fact. So which one of the two is blue as opposed to ocean? Left, yes. This one is blue, this one is ocean. And this one is less informative because it covers more, a bigger chunk of the semantic space. And then what we did is a manipulation in which we created three data sets. One that uses the actual lexicon, namely here we asked, this time we asked not speakers, but listeners, okay? They had to click on the right target. And we have 3 conditions. One is the actual lexicon in which the listener receives purple here and magenta here. The other one is a general lexicon in which here, in both cases, the listener will receive purple. And the last one is the specific condition in which, in both cases, the listener will receive magenta. Yeah. And then what do we compare? Well, first, the accuracy in identifying the right chip. So is communication successful or not? And as you can see, the general condition here is problematic because we have 2 purples, okay? But also the average informativeness of the words used. With this idea that if you use a lot of informative words, you're kind of expending more effort. So that's bad. So higher accuracy is good, higher informativeness is bad. And then we compare them with the expectation that a redundant system will be the best. So here are the results. In the general condition, 80% accuracy, so not great. And we will see that this is a relatively low informativeness, like a low one. In the specific condition in which we have magenta everywhere, here we had purple everywhere, here we have magenta everywhere, the accuracy goes up, which is good, but you know, informativeness, the effort that you need to expend is almost doubles. And then we have the actual system, the actual lexicon, which has the best of both worlds. Accuracy goes even up, even higher up, and informativeness stays between the two. So of course you need more effort than with the general system, but you don't need as much effort as in the specific condition. Yes? And we have a second simulation, this one computational, that yields exactly the same picture. So to recap this part, why do objects have many names? Well, again, so we have this interaction between language as a system, in this case, the lexicon, and language in communication, like the world. And communication takes place in different conditions, right? In different contexts, place different demands on speaker and listener, and then it's more efficient to have a lexicon that actually actively exploits these differences. And what I find really nice is that there's no hand designing this, right? It's just the result of the interaction between individual agents that come up with something that has these very clear and very nice properties. Um, yeah. So interim conclusion for this part, we were saying that language is weird because it's messy. It has these many mappings between words and objects. My conclusion is that it's not so weird after all. And a lot of this messiness is a feature and it's not a bad for the reasons that I've been saying. Okay. Why? Because redundancy and ambiguity are actually useful. Okay. They allow us to talk about new things, so they're good for communication, while staying within our cognitive bounds, which is good for our poor cognitive system. All right. So now the last part, current directions. The first one that I don't have slides on, is that I'm working on modeling semantic change with a computer simulation. So I have neural agents communicating with each other. The idea is to try to do something like, so we are using this data from Monroe, and the idea is to change the context to which the agents are exposed and see how the evolution of general versus specific words, how they evolve, whether they kind of cancel out the more specific ones when they don't need them, this sort of mechanics. So that's one thing I'm doing. But another thing that I've been thinking about lately, because there's been ChatGPT, there's been all this revolution, and this has, again, nothing to do with lexical semantics per se. It's something more general. And so for those of you who have been around for a while, you will be aware that since more or less the mid-50s, there has been a conflict across the cognitive sciences, uh, with really, really opposing views on language and cognition, sometimes really bitterly against each other. With different terms, and not exactly the same dichotomies, but kind of with family resemblances between them. In cognitive science, there's been this opposition between classicism and connectionism, which I assume you're more or less familiar with. In artificial intelligence, symbolic approaches versus distributed approaches. In linguistics, more formal versus more functional approaches, and in particular, there's a book called The Linguistic Wars, like between generative and cognitive linguists. And I'm going to assume you're acquainted with it because I have little time. I hope you more or less are, and if not, I hope it will become clear. And just a note that these kind of debates have long roots in philosophy, in the debate between rationalism and empiricism. And the crux of this conflict, which has become very personal, very violent, very ugly, is that some researchers tend to focus on rule-like aspects of language and cognition, and others on its very slippery and messy nature. And I think that, in my view, they're both right? I've been saying language and cognition. I'll focus on language because this is my domain, but I think much of what I'm going to say extends to other domains. So I have those two theses in a recent position paper. One is that language is rule-like, symbolic, discrete, and slippery, fuzzy, vague, continuous, distributed, what have you, and everything in between. All right. So I think that the fact that this debate exists and has been existing for so many decades or centuries actually is because, language has both properties, and we need to integrate the two. Let me give you an example in case you're not very acquainted with language. So in syntax is a domain that has been exploited with symbolic methods in theoretical linguistics. And indeed, syntax has many aspects that are really rule-like. So if I say, this student tries, I cannot say this student tried. This is just, there's nothing fuzzy about that. It's really rule-like. One is right, the other is wrong. And as I was saying, and then people have been using symbolic discrete formalisms like these kind of trees, right? And everything is discrete. And then you can say, establish some kind of condition saying, okay, if this constituent here is singular, then this one also needs to be singular. That is, subjects need to agree in number with their verbs in English. Yes? And this is very symbolic, very rule-like. Now, lexical semantics, super slippery. Like, if you try to define in which condition you can say a swift action, a fast action, they're not the same, but it's very hard to give a rule like the one that we just gave of singular and plural. It's just, well, it depends, right? And indeed, in this area is where distributed approaches like word embeddings were first applied. Well, first, I don't know, but people converted to distributed representations very fast for lexical semantics in computational linguistics and in cognitive science. All right, so this is my first thesis, that we have both in language. The second thesis is that modern large language models, and more in general deep learning models, are actually a synthesis between these two approaches. Because they support both continuous distributed representations and processing, and also discrete or near discrete, near symbolic representations and processing. And now, those of you who have been in the field for a while, who have read a bit, you will go like, what are you saying, Gemma? Because, neural networks are the hallmark of connectionism, right? So, bear with me. Okay. Now, neural networks. If you know just a little bit about neural networks, you will know that there are neurons, and this part, I apologize because it's the first time I'm talking about this, so it's not as polished as the previous part, but let's see if we can make it work together. So in a neural network, the units are artificial neurons, okay? And so you have this very distributed representation with continuous measures, but crucially, there are so-called nonlinearities. There are nonlinear functions, like the sigmoid. So you have to imagine, or if you know logistic regression, right? You have all these, features that are continuous in nature, and they're coming into the logistic regression function, to the sigmoid function, and then you have an outcome. What happens here? That here you have the potential for both very fuzzy continuous behavior and very discrete behavior. Because if your input here, your input Z, stays around 0, then your output, the output of this sigmoid, is going to be gray, so to speak. It's going to be some kind of continuous number between, say, 0.4, 0.6. Whereas if you get out of this gray zone, then you're going to behave really like a binary switch. So going towards yes or no, to near 0, to near 1. Is that more or less clear, this argument, right? So, and this has been described, like this we know since many decades before, that in principle, neural networks have the potential for both of these behaviors. Now, the question is, what happens in practice? And now we know, because we have massive models that are trained on massive amounts of natural language data, and we can see what they do with this data and with their architecture, with this potential that they have. And since it has been long known that they afford, like this kind of models afford distributed representations, especially in lexical semantics, I'm going to take this for granted. So I'm going to take for granted that the gray zone we have. All right, so we distributed, continuous, messy, tick mark, check mark, we have it. What's not so clear, and many theoretical linguists, for instance, are very resistant to this kind of approach because they see it as, yeah, kind of not scientific enough, not symbolic enough. So what's more recent is the fact that people are uncovering near discrete representations and processing in linguistic deep learning models. For instance, in syntax. And this is nowadays a very, very active field of research in computational linguistics and in artificial intelligence more generally. And it's called, generally it's referred to as interpretability. So work in interpretability has identified individual neurons. For those of you who know it, specific attention heads in a transformer. If you don't worry. And so-called circuits, which again, if you don't know it, don't worry. But what's important here is that these are specific components that are causally involved in grammatical processing and that work very much discretely. And I'm going to give you an example, just one. If you want, I have more examples in the appendix. So individual neurons have been identified that are selective for morphosyntactic properties like number, tense, or part of speech, or that track syntactic relations like agreement or syntactic dependencies. And when I say individual neurons, I mean one parameter out of billions. Nowadays, if you send to a computer linguistics conference a paper based on a model that has 1.7 billion parameters, they will complain that it's too small. So you have to send something that uses at least 13 billions. I'm talking one parameter of these 13 billions that does, for instance, this fun thing that I'm going to tell you about. This is not a large language model. It's a neural machine translation model, but the architecture is the same. And what they found, Bowett and colleagues, is that a single neuron in the controls the tense of the translation. So for instance, I have the committee supported the efforts of the authorities in English. If you apply the neural machine translation model as is, in French, it will tell you the same in French. The committee supported the efforts of the authorities. Now, you change the value of a single neuron that they have identified as controlling tense, and suddenly the translation is the committee supports the efforts of the authorities. And of course, this is just one example, but this is systematic. They have, quantitative data, so this is a robust case. Okay. And in the paper, I have many more examples of this kind of functioning like a switch kind of behavior. So now, to close this part, so as I was saying, in principle, deep learning models have the potential for both messy and well-behaved behavior. In practice, deep learning models for language exhibit both. And these representations, what's nice about them is that they arise in an emergent fashion, right? For instance, in syntax, LLMs learn to behave in a quasi-symbolic fashion because that allows them to perform better at a linguistic task, namely word prediction or machine translation. Yes, if you want to do that well, and you have at your disposal all these parameters with all these nonlinearities, then the best thing you can do is to be fuzzy for lexical semantics and more binary, discrete, symbolic for syntax. And I think that maybe this flexibility between different modes may be one of the main reasons for their amazing, amazing success at capturing natural language. In future work, I would like to see how this pans out in other domains of cognition, like vision or whatever, like many other phenomena. And I expect that these things would generalize, but of course that's a big unknown. And so, yeah, I would like for there to be time for peace because I'm a bit tired of this I don't know in psychology and in cognitive science, whether this debate is more obsolete, but in theoretical linguistics, it's still raging on. There are different communities, different journals, and it's like, you guys are both right. Let's just work together. We need everyone on board. So I'm hoping that we go from confrontation to interaction, to fruitful interaction, but let's see. Doesn't look like a good time for peace these days. Um, and as a general conclusion of the talk, I would say that I hope I have showcased that advances in computational and quantitative methods, including the availability of large-scale data, really afford really cool research in linguistics and cognitive science. And I'm very happy to be a researcher in these times. Thank you. Good. Good. Mhm. Yes, yes. Okay. So I guess what you found is that in contexts where the article is more easily predictable, it will be dropped. And in cases in which it's less predictable, it will be. Oh, wow. Okay. Nice. I see. I see. Yeah. So in this sense, now I understand. In this sense, articles in Dutch are less informative, so they're also less needed in general. Yeah. Yeah. That's really cool. Yeah. If I yeah later I will ask you for the reference. What the models it makes the models work better. Yes. Mhm. Yeah, and that's why we need these kind of mechanisms, because actually for language change, at least one of the traditions in generative linguistics posits that only children change language, right? Because when they acquire, they reanalyze the structures and then there's change. But actually, there's a lot of evidence that a lot of change is driven also by adults. And then you need a system that can accommodate messiness, right? Because if you just assume a categorical, totally symbolic system, it's much more difficult to accommodate probabilities or like context in which things can change. That's one question. That's one thing. The other thing is in the debate about like the biases that like cognitive biases that humans have that allow them to use language, which obviously we have because humans speak and turtles don't speak, so there's something in our cognitive system that makes us able to learn and use a language. And I think the question there is, which I guess is where you're pointing to when you talk about children acquiring languages, I think there we need to ask ourselves, what is the shape of this cognitive bias? All right. Is it, and like if you want to call about universal grammar, no? How does this universal grammar look like? Is it really a grammar or is it something more general? And I think so. I've just started thinking specifically about this, so I don't have any answers as to connecting, language acquisition to large language models, other than this intuition that these non-linearities are crucial. So the potential, let's say, the potential for moving between the two modes and also integrating them, because there's lots of in between, is crucial. And here, maybe let me give you another example. So I'm giving syntax as the hallmark of a rule-like behavior, right? You can say the student tries, and you cannot say the student tried. But even agreement, which is kind of like the epitome of rule-like behavior, it also is fuzzy. If I say a group of students is crossing the street, you can also say a group of students are crossing the street. And here you have a singular noun, group, which suddenly can agree in number with a plural verb, are, which is totally forbidden in this case, right? So even agreement breaks down. And there comes the semantics, because this only happens with nouns denoting pluralities. So, and in my view, a lot of the messiness of language comes from lexical semantics, right? Or from semantics in general, but specifically from things that have to do with conceptual aspects of meaning. Because there, with concepts, we cannot have, black and white distinctions. There's no necessary and sufficient conditions for meanings because we encounter new things all the time. So if words were closed, we wouldn't be able to extend them to new reference that we find that maybe have combinations of properties that we have never seen. So this is a necessity. We cannot just have a symbolic system for that. And sorry, I think my response was long enough, but I hope more or less I have addressed at least partially what you have said.
Yeah, thank you. I have two questions. One has to do with the first part of the talk when you were talking about this semantics, linearity relation that can explain language evolution and the use of the different same words meaning different things. But are you talking only about policing, not on means? So, for instance, that is the animal or the label stuff or right, which is a direction or correct. I don't think you can, use semantic similarity. It's just so I had to check for English homonyms because by definition homonyms are within a language.
Yes.
Whereas polysemous words are across languages.
Yes.
So this one thing, you said that you do not, use lexical ambiguity for these things, but was there in your data set also cases of homonyms?
Yes.
verb. Imagine that there are no languages that use the same word to refer to fair or for or whatever. In a way, did you have examples also of this kind? In a way, because of course, 99% of the words are not related. How? Because the example you made was cheap in bracelet. Okay, easy. But what about third and fourth? I mean, how did you choose the negative?
Thank you for your questions. These are crucial aspects. Like the first one is our data set. I mean, the technical term that is used in this context is co-lexification, which is kind of the opposite of polysemy. So in polysemy, you have a word and several meanings. In co-lexification, you have several meanings, and you see how they are put in the same word, right? So-called semasiological perspective instead of monomosiological perspective. Well, anyway. This term colexification, that I've just used lexical ambiguity because it's not well known in different forums. This doesn't distinguish between polysemy, homonymy, and even the underspecification, because you could say, well, it's not a case of polysemy, it's a case of underspecification. You just say, limbs that are at the end of, right? And we don't distinguish those, the data that we use. What does this mean in theoretical terms? Okay, let me see if I can get this straight. In our data, there may be homonymy, and I'm sure there will be homonymy, although we didn't specifically check for it. But we do not predict that there will be no homonymy, right? What we predict is that there will be more polysemy, and this is what you find in the world's languages. Think about it. Homonymy from a communicative point of view would be much better than polysemy. It would be much better if from a naive point of view at least, if we had homonymy, because if you say bat in a given context, it's very difficult that you're going to confuse the bat with the animal. Whereas with did, you can be, okay, but which, was it the hand, was it the foot, no? Now, what we predict is that there will be less polysemy less homonymy than polysemy. But for this kind of investigation, I think it's important not to exclude any case, like to include everything and see what kinds of cases we find. And you are able to generalize polysemic patterns across languages to quite a large extent because, all share the cognitive foundations, whereas you cannot generalize homonymy because, they're not cognitively motivated, right? So in this sense, I think that this is in accordance with the view that we have put forth in the paper, although we don't distinguish them. Does that make sense?
No, so in the test session.
No, yeah, now I come to the...
Completely different results if you test real existing polysymous words or real existing
Exactly.
homonyms.
Yes.
So they will not be able to predict
exactly. Exactly. That's completely right. And to the extent that there is homonymy in the dataset, which I don't know to what extent, I would fully predict it to be in the errors of the model. That the model was like 70-80% correct. I'm sure that homonymy is in the errors. I'm positive, precisely because it's not predictable. Now, the second question was about how we choose negative examples. What we did is to choose them randomly, which also means that we can also choose things that maybe are colexified. No, sorry. So we have things like chicken bracelet that have nothing to do with each other. So it is easier than if we had chosen them. But 2 points here. One is that what's relevant for us is not so much beyond the fact that it works reasonably well, so that we are not just doing 55%, but way above 50%. What's relevant for us is not how good it is, but how well it generalizes. And in this sense, all the phenomena are under the same conditions because we are choosing the negative examples in the exact same way. So I think that doesn't invalidate the results of the experiment. That being said, we also have a second experiment that I didn't talk about, second simulation, which is because it's true that if you just compare unrelated things to related things, then it's kind of a very dichotomous situation. But what we did, because we Our hypothesis was that, no, that was a second thing. No. That was in the other paper, but maybe let me just quickly say it. So, our hypothesis was that it's not so much semantic relatedness that was driving the results, but it was really confusability in context. So there, in that case, we did check different kinds of semantic relatedness to see which ones were the ones driving the results. And since it's kind of late and I don't want to get into details, we can talk later if you want. But there we did find evidence that it was not so much semantic relatedness, but really confusability in context that was driving the results. And the way we did that was by testing different kinds of semantic relationships. But I think it doesn't address your point because that was in the other article. So sorry about that. I don't know if, yeah. I mean, I have all the time in the world, but I don't know how long these sessions are.
What do you think would be the effect of context on the building of principle? In a way, context would make even different words, homonyms more acceptable, probably. Do you think that would be the case?
Sorry, can you say again?
I was wondering about the effect of the context on the building of principle. So if I understood it right, it's like a shape function where very unacceptable are very close and very far away. But what is the role of context, you think, in this principle? In a way, if you have sentences that points to a very informative name, even if you include the name that's very different, not fully related to the name you're substituting, the context that does, in a way,
Yeah. Yeah.
so it would change the function of this, of the goal function that you're describing.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you base the principle on your previous studies, where you train the model on single words, and whether that would change the results if you somehow use words in context.
I see. So these studies that I presented are made at the level of the lexicon, the whole lexicon. And in this case, we do not test production at all. Like, well, we test it only insofar as production and comprehension processes are reflected in the structure of the lexicon. But we are really staying at the level of the individual meanings and the accompanying words. So the way context acts in this case is by kind of aggregation over many contexts, in the sense that if you have many different communicative situations in which you need to express a given semantic distinction, then this will work against your tendency to put related things in the same word, like left and right. Okay? So that's how context plays, but it would be really cool to check what happens with actual production processes, how this interacts with production or comprehension, but we haven't tested that. Thank you.
So I have two observations, two comments, are not specifically related to what you did, but the first thing is that while you were describing your main meaning part, and if I understood it correctly, the take-home message was that when we are assigning words or labels to concepts, we do that striking a balance between distinctiveness and similarity, right? We want things to be, so if things are too similar, we won't choose something else, or if they're too distinctive, we won't interfere communication, and so we choose something else. And this was really making me think about all that we know about the balance between arbitrariness and systematicity in language. This is what I do when I study. And I can just probably like substitute arbitrariness and systematicity and get to the same
Yes.
idea, which
Yes.
is something that's really interesting because it seems like this might be one of those regulative principles of our cognitive system, right?
Yes. Yes.
Always being in a balance and to maximize our ability to learn new things. So
Yeah.
we want to be creative, and at the same time we want to be effective when
Yeah.
we are communicating. Which is so interesting to see something
similar in with another process, which is labeling.
Yeah.
And also, it's quite interesting because also in the systematicity literature we see that there is quite the same phenomenon. So words that are more systematic are, for example, earlier on and are more resistant to historical change.
Yes.
So this is it's really something to think about, and I really loved it. And I will go back and reread all your works because this is something that it's really interesting. And the second thing concerns the uh, switch, what the sigmoid function and the switch between distributed and um, symbolic in a way, categorical behavior. And I was thinking, but this is my completely nonsense, but I was thinking if this could also reflect in the way we produce behavioral responses. Like when we have to produce a response, and many times we have to give just one response. So distribution doesn't help very much in saying yes or no, or red or green, or something like that. And at one point we have to find a cutoff where we switch and we say yes, left, right.
Exactly.
And I was wondering how this, of course, concerns representation, but it's also one of the might be one of the links with actually producing a response in
Yes.
some way.
Yes.
Don't know.
I totally agree there. Yeah. And even like large language models, right? At the end of the day, they output a probability distribution over the whole vocabulary. But then in practice, what they do is like they print a specific word on your screen, right? So in this sense, it's there is a clear analogy. That's why I was saying that I think that whatever is going on in the brain, it has to do also with this. Well, also, I've been told that real neurons, like flesh and blood neurons, I'm not sure if they have blood, but they are more like mini neural networks than artificial neurons, right? So probably they're very complex, but at the end of the day, they also have this thing of either fighting or not fighting in a way, right? So I think this is something very, very, very fundamental to cognition, and there's something deep, like there's something more basic, fundamental underlying all of this that we should be able to spell out, and it has to do exactly with what you're saying, with the fact that we have a lot of features, say, for instance, in perception, but a lot of our things are categorical, right? Like, I don't know, do we pass the card to enter the metro or not, right? And then there's a lot of fuzziness in the movement, but at the end of the day, it's like, do you get in the metro or you don't? Also to communicate. Also.
Back to what we were saying with the
Yeah.
names and many things, right?
Yes.
At one point, with language,
Yes.
yes, we have many names or many concepts associated to one word, or we have many names associated to just to one concept, but in the end, we communicate with one.
Yeah, and that's a very important aspect because actually reference is something that we treat very much as discrete. Like there's, for instance, two people with the same name. We don't want to conflate them, right? So yeah, anything that has to do with reference, we treat very much like if we say he, we mean a specific he, not just any. So yeah. There's and if I may say something, the systematicity and arbitrariness, it's a literature I don't know. So if we can talk later, maybe I would be glad to catch on that. But that's again, even in semantics, it's not all fuzzy, right? Lexical semantics is fuzzy, but reference is not fuzzy. So yeah.
And then, yeah, there are also many other variables that, like what Marco was saying, context sometimes really constrains to where something makes something more probable than other. And
Exactly.
at one point, we decide that these things mean these things, and that's it.
And some contexts are more dichotomous than others. I think that's where you were going, no, Marco? Like that in some contexts you have some room for variation, and in some others you don't. So yeah. So there's also the level of the single context. There is this dichotomy of like dichotomy, no, this continuum between being very binary or very kind of open to variation. Thank you.
I was wondering about what your thoughts are on localization talking about the brain,
Localization, you meaning?
neural networks, like single neurons taking on some function like reading, for example. Because talking about the brain, this reminds me about neural cells. So some neurons that are identified, or like
Yes.
when they see a specific person, for example.
Yes.
So one of the criticisms about this view is that these are very fragile. So just losing that neurons means you cannot recognize the ground. So here, do you think it's a desirable property to observe in a system that is cognitive for it to have a very important function localized in a single neuron, or rather we should expect something to be still acting as a symbol, but still distributed throughout the neurons? Because you can have symbolic processes that are spread out over the entire population of neurons. I was wondering, what do you think about it when you see that a lot of important processes are localized in a single neuron?
Yeah. Well, this is a very ambitious question, and several things here. One is that the fact that some neuron is selective for something doesn't mean that it's the only unit that is selective for that. So in neural networks, there's two things. No, one is there's kind of two properties that now I don't remember. One is called polysemanticity, and the other I can't remember. Superposition. So basically, you have the fact that a single neuron can code different things, and a single thing can be coded by different neurons, which is what makes it distributed by definition, right? And neural networks, artificial neural networks, are redundant. So there's a lot of things that are redundant in the system. And for instance, this circuit thing, which is something that it's an interpretable algorithm that you can decode. The people, there was one of the circuits that they described, and what they found is that if they deleted it from the network, there were some other parts of the network that partially took up the roles of that circuit. It performed worse, but it still could do somewhat. And it is reminiscent, again, this is an analogy, so no, but a bit reminiscent of the brain, right? In which, even if you damage something, then more or less you preserve some functionalities. And I think redundancy is a very important property of any cognitive system. Now, localization must also be important, because otherwise we wouldn't find it, neither in artificial neural, nor in biological neural networks. And that's the intriguing part, no? Like, if you could have everything be distributed, why do you have these localized things? And I think that it's very important. It must be an important property. And I think maybe I hadn't thought about that, but Simona's comment made me think that maybe it does have to do with this thing that at the end of the day, a lot of the things that we do are discrete in the sense of like specific actions. So I'm guessing it has to do with that, with our ability to be able to say left or right. But this is pure speculation, and I would love to, find out more about that.
Why do you think there is redundancy in this artificial system? Because usually when you think about the brain, one of the strongest arguments because of this to explain this redundancy is because evolution. So we have issues by living in an environment that might affect part of the brain, and we having another part of the brain can do the same thing is useful. But these things do not have brain injuries or strokes. So why do they develop this redundancy?
Yeah, I mean, in some cases, this is something that is enforced by the researcher, because they introduce at training time, they introduce something called dropout, which is that they delete some parts of the network so that to prevent overfitting, this helps with generalization. All right. Now, I don't know if in the recent architectures that we have, where they have so many billions of parameters and stuff, I don't know if they still introduce dropout at training time. So in the former case, they would be putting evolution by hand, no? I'm putting dropout so that you can generalize, because in practice they generalize better. But I don't know if the latest models, they still do that or not, and they develop it spontaneously. Because one thing that's very nice that I don't know if you guys know is that they've discovered this thing. I think they call it double descent or something like that. Like if you usually we've all been said, don't use a model with too many parameters because it will not generalize, it will overfit. This is bad science. But then it turns out with these huge models, if you measure performance on unseen data, like first it grows, then it degrades as it overfits, but then if you make them large enough, it goes up again. So it's like they need a lot of capacity to find truly general solutions. And in this case of truly general solutions, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know how they get there. And I don't know if in these cases, and I don't know if this is that these generalization capacities are related to the redundancy issue or not, now that I think of it. So basically my answer is I don't know enough about truly modern models to know if they are also kind of being steered into that direction or is an emergent property just that arises just so. Thank you. I'm here until tomorrow morning if anybody